The streets of Nixur smelled like stone warmed by morning sun and flowers trying too hard to hide the rust. It was a city both ancient and modern, built in layers. History buried beneath chrome and glass, memory tucked behind marble arches, and transit rails humming with energy. Cale Wren stepped into its heart with nothing but a faded jacket, a satchel of cracked tools, and the last remnants of hope clinging to the soles of his boots. He had come a long way, across trade routes and ghost corridors, through dead stations where lights no longer blinked, chased by silence, driven by something he couldn't name, a feeling, a pull. He only wanted directions. The central plaza was alive with motion. Merchants called from sunlit stalls, selling things that sparkled or sang or shimmered with illusions. Children ran barefoot along the edges of kinetic fountains, sending waves of color into the air. Drones hovered lazily, monitoring traffic but not much else. Kyle walked slowly, soaking in the alien normalcy. The people here were tall, skin marked with faint patterns like liquid glass beneath the surface. Their eyes glowed softly, their voices smooth, layered with tones humans never evolved to replicate. But they didn't look threatening, just used to their world. He stepped toward the edge of the plaza, where a girl stood alone by the largest fountain. She was younger than the others, no older than 20 by human standards. Her hair was short, silver blue, cut to frame a narrow face that was both sharp and unsure. She wore no ornament, no badge of caste, just a pale tunic and a bracelet carved from old bone. Cale cleared his throat gently. She didn't look up, so he smiled and said, "Hi. I think I'm a little lost." She turned and screamed. Not a cry of surprise, a scream of terror, full and sharp. It cut through the plaza like a blade through silk. Her eyes locked on his face, wide with horror. Then her voice rose again, this time a single word that made the world around him stop breathing. "A human!" Every sound died. The drones froze. The fountains stuttered. Merchants dropped what they were holding. And the city, so alive just seconds ago, turned to stone. Cale blinked. Wait, what? But she was already running, barefoot across the tiles, pushing past stunned bystanders, her cry still echoing through the open sky. Gasps spread like wildfire. And then guards, not soldiers, not police, but something far more precise. Tall figures in deep violet armor stepped out from nowhere, their helmets gleaming, their weapons humming to life with terrifying calm. "Target located," one said. Cale stepped back. "Number. You don't understand. I just—" But there was no time. The city had made its decision, and Cale was already running. The undercity of Nixur was not built for humans. Cale dropped 3 levels through the transit shaft before the doors malfunctioned and spat him into a corridor that smelled of rust, dust, and forgotten energy. The polished marble of the plaza was long gone. Down here, walls sweated condensation and blinked with faded runes etched centuries before he was born. If he had been born on Earth at all. His breath came heavy, not from running, from being chased by memory he didn't understand. He leaned against a broken rail, clutching his side where a shot had grazed his jacket. He wasn't hurt, but his heart raced with something worse than fear, recognition. The way they looked at him, the way she screamed, like he was a ghost from a nightmare they thought buried. Cale had no answers, just questions, and a growing hunger to find someone, anyone, who could explain why his face had turned a city to silence. A dim hallway stretched ahead, lit by faint blue lines in the floor. He followed them without thinking, his boots quiet on the metal. Down a stairwell, across a tunnel half collapsed from time, and into a chamber where the walls breathed softly with residual power. He stopped, In the center of the room stood a monolith. Tall, black, its surface smooth but pulsing faintly with light. He stepped forward, drawn by something inside his chest, something that had nothing to do with logic. And then he saw it, etched into the base of the monolith. Human design interface detected. The words flickered once, then stabilized. Call's breath caught. He reached out, fingers trembling. The moment his skin touched the surface, the room lit up. Not with light, with memory. Images exploded across the chamber. Projections from the walls, the ceiling, the monolith itself. Soldiers in white armor standing shoulder to shoulder with alien allies. Human voices giving orders. Children laughing beneath twin suns. Then flames. Betrayal, the severing of treaties, the shattering of trust. And then the silence. A voice spoke, not aloud, but directly into his bones. You were erased. Call stumbled back. The light dimmed. And the monolith spoke again. But not forgotten. His hands shook. He didn't understand. But he believed. Somewhere above him, the city was hunting. But here, something had remembered him before he ever arrived. Meanwhile, Lyra Vell sat in a narrow attic above a closed bookshop, her knees pulled to her chest. Her grandmother's old scroll lay open beside her, pages yellowed, ink faded. The forbidden glyph glowed faintly under her fingertips. A name no one spoke. Human. She whispered it to herself, lips trembling. He looked scared. The scream still echoed in her head. Not his. Heron, and the memory in her grandmother's final words came back clearer than ever. One day, if you see a man who speaks gently, whose eyes do not match our colors, do not run. Listen, he carries a voice older than war. The room was hidden behind a false wall of glass and light, woven into the roots of Nixer's old city. To most, it was just another archive chamber sealed by time. But Serenkai knew better. She moved through the shadows in silence, her fingers brushing ancient symbols carved into the stone, watching as they responded to her touch, not with light, but with recognition. The Guild of Memory had long been disbanded, branded as romanticists, liars, traitors. Their scrolls burned, their history dissolved into sanctioned doctrine. But Seren had kept one room intact, because she believed the past did not vanish. It waited. And now, someone had awoken it. A ripple of energy had pulsed through the archives only hours ago, human-coded, live. She had followed it here, and she wasn't alone. As the door hissed open, she stepped inside. Carl was standing in the center of the chamber, still surrounded by flickering images, the kind only guild technology could store. A library of light, history sculpted in motion. He didn't hear her enter. He was too busy watching himself not exist. A dozen projections spiraled around him, humans at peace, humans at war, humans being erased, scrolls rewritten, statues dismantled, records overwritten with falsified origins. And finally, silence. Seren didn't speak until he turned. His eyes were wide, not afraid, not broken, just searching. You came to the right place, she said. Carl blinked. Who are you? Someone who remembers, she said simply, and someone who was told to forget. Carl stepped back. What is this place? A scar, she said. One the galaxy tried to bandage. You pulled it open again. He looked down at the monolith in the center of the room, the same one he had touched. It now pulsed with a golden hue, not warning, welcoming. I didn't mean to. Seren studied him for a long moment. The truth never asks for permission. Then another voice, timid, fragile. I remember that symbol. They both turned. Lyra stood in the doorway. She looked different now. No longer the girl who screamed, still afraid but also curious. She stepped forward, eyes locked on the flickering projection of a human soldier helping a Nixorian child onto a shuttle. "My grandmother told me this story," Lyra whispered. "But she said it was only a tale. Something passed down in secret. That the human helped save our ancestors when the sky cracked open. That he asked nothing in return. That he disappeared before anyone could say thank you." Kyle watched her. "Maybe that was someone like me," he said softly. "Or maybe that was me. I honestly don't know anymore." Silence settled. Then Lyra turned to him fully. "You're not what they said." "No," Kale replied, "and I don't think you are either." They stood in the light of memory, three people divided by history, now tethered by something no weapon could burn: truth. And for the first time, Lyra didn't run. She stepped forward, held out her hand. Kale hesitated, then took it, and the monolith blazed brighter than ever before. The news spread faster than protocol could contain it. Someone had activated a human relic. Worse, two citizens, one of them a girl barely of age, had been seen touching the artifact and surviving. The Guild of Memory, once labeled obsolete, had lit up on every surveillance node. The name Kyle Wren now echoed across every encrypted channel in Nixer's governing tiers. The council responded like it always did, by tightening its grip. In the high towers of command, High Marshal Kelvor stood in silence, watching as footage from the archive chamber streamed across the curved walls, the monolith glowing, the girl's hand in his, ancient code blooming like wildfire. Kelvor's voice was low, final. "Eliminate them both, burn the records, collapse the entry." Orders were dispatched. The machines below began to move. Elsewhere, in tunnels that hadn't seen light in decades, Coil and Lyra ran. Not because they were being chased, but because they would be, soon. Seren Kai led the way, her fingers glowing faintly as she traced old escape routes hidden beneath the city's maintenance grid. The pathways responded to her like they remembered her, as if the tunnels were loyal to memory more than command. Coil could hear the hum of the council's hunter units echoing through distant corridors, not machines, not flesh, something in between, bred not to think, only to erase. "They know," Coil said. Lyra glanced at him. "They always knew. They just hoped no one else would." They slipped through an old port lock and into a collapsed atrium, once a station for diplomatic arrivals. Now, dust-choked and half-buried, mosaics of unity lay cracked under their feet. Lyra stopped. "This used to be beautiful," she said. Kale looked at her. "It still is." She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Seren crouched beside a panel embedded in the floor. "There's a path below, leads to the old temple lines. If the core legends are true, that's where the last Guardian armor is kept." Coil hesitated. "I'm not a Guardian." "You touched the monolith," Seren said without looking at him. "You woke it. That makes you something. And something is more than what they want you to believe you are." Lyra stepped forward. "My grandmother used to whisper that the Guardians didn't die. They went quiet, waiting for the right question." Kale looked at her, and something inside him shifted. Not pain, not even fear, permission. "To ask? To remember," she said, "and to stand where others were made to kneel." The floor shook. A distant boom echoed up the shaft. "They're collapsing the tunnel," Seren said. Lyra grabbed Kale's hand, not gently, like someone choosing this over silence. "This way." They dropped into the shaft, and as the last slab of ceiling fell behind them, cutting them off from the city above, Coil turned to her. "Why did you come back?" he asked. Lyra paused in the dark, her eyes golden even in shadow. "Because my grandmother didn't scream when she saw a human." He stared. She loved him. Coil didn't know what to say, so he just followed her into the dark, where history waited, and truth began again. The air grew warmer the deeper they went. Not from heat, from memory. Coil felt it in his chest before he saw it, like something old had been waiting just beyond every breath. The tunnel opened into a massive subterranean chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow, walls covered in glyphs that pulsed faintly like the heartbeat of something sleeping beneath the stone. They had arrived. The Temple of Truth, built before the councils, before the wars, before even the fear. Lyra stepped forward first, her torchlight casting soft gold across murals, half faded and half glowing. The images were carved deep, scenes of people not unlike her standing beside figures with human faces and star-braided armor. Some held weapons, others raised hands over cities. One mural showed a man, eyes closed, standing before a sea of fire, arms wide. She touched the edge of the wall. Her fingers trembled. This was never in the archives. Seren, close behind them, nodded slowly, because they erased it, not just the facts, the language. This was our alliance, our beginning. Coil moved past them both, drawn forward. At the center of the chamber stood a raised dais. Upon it, a suit of armor, sleek, silver, and ancient. Time had not dulled its shine. It pulsed softly with a light beneath the surface, as if the metal itself breathed. Coil didn't speak. He didn't need to. The armor recognized him. A low hum filled the chamber. The glyphs around the wall shifted, rearranging themselves into a single phrase, now readable in every tongue. Guardian detected. Legacy initiated. Lyra's breath caught. "You didn't just find the temple," she whispered. "It found you." Coil stepped up onto the platform. He reached out slowly, hand hovering above the chest plate. And when he touched it, everything changed. Light exploded outward, not burning, but restoring. The glyphs danced across the walls. The chamber lit with lines of gold, circuits like rivers rediscovering their flow. The armor rose into the air and wrapped around him piece by piece, adjusting, welcoming, not forcing, accepting. Cale dropped to one knee as the last piece sealed over his shoulder. He expected weight. Instead, he felt clarity. A voice spoke, low, deep, familiar, and unknown. Guardian reactivation complete. Directive, protect, preserve, rekindle. He looked up, and Lyra stood there, hands pressed to her chest, tears in her eyes. "You were never lost," she said. Cale blinked slowly. "No," he replied. "I was hidden, like everything else." A tremor shook the chamber. Seren turned toward the tunnel. "They found us." Cale stood, taller now in the armor, silver light tracing every motion. "Then they'll see what they buried." He turned to Lyra. "You don't have to stay." She stepped closer. "I was always meant to." They stood together as the stones above groaned, and dust fell from ancient beams. Not just running, not hiding, but rising. The ground shook beneath them. Not from bombs, from awakening. Above, in the city they had fled, High Marshal Kelvor's order echoed like a sentence written before the crime. Bury the temple. Bury the truth. All access tunnels were collapsing in sequence, detonated from orbit. The Council believed that if they silenced the Earthborn one last time, history would stay asleep. But the past did not sleep. It remembered, and now it replied. Cale stood at the heart of the temple, wrapped in silver armor that glowed from within. Not just technology, inheritance. The system hummed around him, adapting to his pulse, his voice, his presence. On the wall behind him, the glyphs had changed again. Not just guardian, not just legacy. Now, one word pulsed brighter than all others: unity. Lyra pressed her hand to the same symbol. At first, nothing. Then, an answering light. It spread from her palm, met Kale's in the center of the dais, and the chamber responded. The walls rumbled. Stone split, not in collapse but in transformation. Panels unfolded. Machinery bloomed from ancient crevices. A central core emerged, spinning slowly, projecting a map of the galaxy. Dozens of systems lit up, then died out. One by one, Seren stepped forward. These are the lost outposts, places where the Guardians once stood. Coil looked at her. They fell? No, she whispered. They were cut off, like nerves severed from a mind. Lyra moved closer, her voice small but steady. This temple, it was a hub, a last signal node, and we just turned it back on. Outside, the air thickened, heavy steps, marching, the sound of the Council's hybrid enforcers, the kind that didn't bleed. They're almost here, Seren said, drawing her old blade. It glowed faintly, more ceremonial than useful. Coil turned toward the open archway, his armor pulsing with light. He didn't draw a weapon, he was one. No more running, he said. Then he looked at Lyra. You don't have to fight. She stepped beside him. I'm not here to fight, she said. I'm here to stand. Together, they moved to the front of the chamber, where the light of the map bled into the dark of the tunnel. The enforcers emerged, rows of them, faceless, identical, moving like a tide. Coil lifted his hand. A pulse of energy spread from his palm. Not violent, not destructive. Just truth. The first wave of enforcers froze. Confused. A second later, the ones in front shorted. Not from damage, from recognition. Their systems were not built to resist a Guardian's command. They were built to obey. One by one, their lights dimmed. Then they stepped aside. Not all, but enough. Kelvor's voice crackled over the stolen comms. This changes nothing. Coil stared at the wall of enemies who were no longer sure if they had the right target. It changes everything, he answered. Above the surface, the skies of Nixer twisted with clouds no storm had summoned. Ships from the Council hovered like blades drawn against the horizon, their hulls sleek and black, casting long shadows over the city they ruled with silence and threat. Below, in the once-forgotten temple, light surged through stone. Coil stood tall in the Silver Guardian armor, a living echo of a past long buried. At his side, Lyra's hand hovered over the console, now glowing with active glyphs. Together, they had activated the Unity Protocol, and now the planet was listening. So was the rest of the system. High Marshal Kelvor's voice thundered across all frequencies, hijacking civilian comms. Attention, citizens of Nixer. You are witnessing unauthorized technology reactivated in defiance of Council law. Do not be deceived. The so-called Guardian is a myth. Stand down or face planetary cleansing. Coil looked up. Then he stepped forward. The temple had risen with him, a spire of white gold crystal emerging from beneath the city's roots, piercing upward. Platforms unfolded. Towers aligned. The planet did not rebel, it remembered. Coil raised one hand. The armor shimmered, refracting the sky into mirrored waves. Kelvor's warship opened fire. Torrents of plasma screamed through the air, heading straight for the temple. Coil moved. He did not block. He did not raise a shield. He simply stood, and the temple responded. Light surged around him. A dome of energy erupted from the spire's heart, bending the plasma, folding it into streams of harmless heat that danced like auroras across the upper sky. Citizens watched from windows and rooftops, no longer afraid, only stunned. Lyra activated the signal beacon. Her voice went out over the same stolen comms, steady and calm. My name is Lyra Vell. I was told to fear the humans. I was told they were chaos, monsters, ghosts of war. She paused. Then I met one. The beacon pulsed, and behind her, holographic images lit the sky, memories recovered from the temple archives, guardians standing beside Nyxorians, humans repairing cities after the solar collapse, a child with golden eyes riding on a human's shoulders, smiles, tears, sacrifice, truth. The guardians never left, Lyra said. They were silenced, erased, because someone feared what unity could do. She turned to Kale. And now, one has returned. The warships in the sky began to waver, not physically, politically. The people were no longer listening to Kelvor. They were watching a man who did not attack, who simply stood. The first warship turned, not to fire, but to flee. The second shut down its weapons array. Kelvor's voice returned, desperate. Do not believe this spectacle. Do not... The transmission cut. Someone, from inside, had silenced him. And then, the skies cleared. Light broke over the horizon, not from a sun, but from a people seeing something for the first time. Hope. Kale stepped back from the edge, his armor pulsing gently. Lyra took his hand. This was never about war, he said. No, she replied. It was always about who we're allowed to become. The city of Nyxor was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet that came from control or fear. This silence felt earned, full, like the final breath after a long song. Cole stood at the edge of the new plaza, looking up at the monument they had built overnight, not from order, not from law, but from choice. It was simple. A stone arch etched with two silhouettes, one human, one Nyxorian, standing side by side beneath a rising sun. No weapons, no armor, just hands held out. Open. Lyra approached from behind. She wore no insignia now, no robe of caste, just a loose tunic and a pendant Cole had seen once in the archives, a symbol once burned into Guardian halls, the symbol for beginning. You think they'll keep it standing? She asked. Cole nodded slowly. They built it, not because they were told, because they remembered. Children played near the base of the monument, laughing, tracing the outlines of names carved into the lower stone. Names of guardians, names of those who had once been erased. Now remembered. Seren Kai stood nearby, speaking with young initiates of the reformed Guild of Memory. Their scrolls were open again, no longer hidden. Stories, once forbidden, were now taught out loud. Coyle looked at Lyra. You were the first to listen, she smiled. You were the first not to run. They walked together through the market, now alive again. Merchants laughed. Music played. The city breathed. Above them, stars blinked in patterns once familiar only to Kale. Now, they belonged to everyone. In the sky, a signal light blinked. Not a warning, an invitation. Coyle turned to Lyra. It's spreading. Yes, she said. We lit a match. And now? Lyra reached out, took his hand. Now we write the next chapter. Somewhere far beyond Nyxor, on a planet no map had held in centuries, another monolith awoke. Another guardian armor stirred, and someone else, human or not, would soon hear the same call Cole once followed. Remember, what if your story was never meant to end with survival, but with meaning? Would you fade back into silence or step forward and help others speak the truth they were told to forget? Leave a comment, because sometimes all it takes to change the galaxy is one scream, and one person willing to stay.